At first, this was just about keeping warm. But suddenly, it became something else entirely. Every nerve in my body ached for his warmth, and I realized a fire had been lit deep inside me. Chapter 1. The storm begins. The sharp mountain air filled my lungs as I clutched my snowboard under my arm. Standing at the edge of the ski slope, I had always loved sports the way my body moved, the way my muscles worked in perfect harmony. It wasn't just a hobby, it was who I was. Years of weight training had sculpted my strong, muscular legs, which were accentuated by my form-fitting ski leggings. My narrow waist and curvy hips created a striking contrast, turning heads, but I didn't really care. This trip was supposed to be a family getaway, a break from my intense training schedule. My dad had insisted. A remote, peaceful ski resort sounded like a dream to him. My mom, my dad, and my Uncle James. James was different from the rest of my family. He was a few years younger than my dad, rugged, good-looking, tall, athletic, always drawn to adventure. While my dad preferred tropical vacations, James thrived in the wild skiing, climbing, exploring places most people considered too dangerous. Today, he had decided to teach me how to ski. "You're too tense," he chuckled, standing beside me at the edge of the slope. His voice was deep, slightly teasing, always carrying a hint of amusement. "You're too focused on control. Skiing isn't about control. It's about letting go." I rolled my eyes, shaking my head. "I don't want to fall, James." "Then you're in the wrong sport, sweetheart." He winked. "All right, let's go. I'll be right behind you." The first few minutes were amazing. The icy wind brushed against my face, the crisp snow gliding under my skis, both terrifying and exhilarating. James skied beside me effortlessly, as if he had been doing it his whole life. Every time I wobbled, he just laughed. And then the storm hit. At first, it was just light snowfall, tiny crystals drifting through the sky. But within minutes, the wind howled. The snow thickened, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. "James!" I shouted, my voice lost in the wind. "I'm here." He grabbed my wrist firmly. "We need to get out of this, now." Panic set in as we tried to navigate through the whiteout. The ski lodge was too far. My legs were burning, my breath coming out in ragged gasps in the freezing air. Then, through the swirling snow, James spotted something a small, abandoned ski patrol cabin. "There!" he shouted, pulling me forward, shouldering the door open. We stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. Outside, the world had vanished into a blinding, howling storm. But inside, everything was suddenly quiet. The cabin was tiny, a single-room structure. An old fireplace sat in one corner, a wooden table in another. A few thick blankets stacked neatly nearby. My whole body was trembling, my ski jacket soaked through. "Take off your jacket," James said, shrugging off his own. "If we stay wet, we'll freeze." I hesitated, hyper-aware of the strange tension between us. My fingers trembled as I unzipped my jacket, revealing the tight thermal top clinging to my body. James' gaze lingered for a second before he quickly looked away, exhaling deeply. "This storm isn't letting up anytime soon," he muttered, turning toward the fireplace. Striking a match, he lit a fire, the small flame flickering to life. Shadows danced across the cabin walls, casting sharp lines along James' face, his chiseled jaw. Those stormy blue eyes, the way his damp hair clung to his forehead. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. It had to be the cold, right? Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the tension between us only grew stronger. Chapter 2. Flames and Forbidden Desires. The crackling of the fireplace began to warm the cabin, but the chill inside me still hadn't faded. I'd shed my wet clothes and wrapped myself in an old blanket. James sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, lost in thought. "How long do you think we'll be here?" I asked, breaking the silence. James shrugged. "If the storm keeps up like this, probably until morning." That thought sent a strange shiver down my spine. A small, secluded cabin in the middle of the night, alone with James. I tried to push away the uneasy feeling, but my eyes betrayed me, drifting over to him. He had taken off his soaked shirt, and the firelight cast shifting shadows over his toned body. "You're shivering," he said, his gaze finally meeting mine. "If the blanket isn't enough, you should sit closer to the fire." I bit my lip and nodded slightly, scooting toward the fireplace. Pulling my knees to my chest, I tried to steady my racing heart. James didn't look away. There was something in his eyes. Something restrained. "This storm came out of nowhere," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. "Yeah," I whispered, but I had a feeling we weren't just talking about the weather anymore. The forbidden line between us blurred further in the flickering firelight. Chapter 3. Closed doors, rising tension. As the warmth from the fireplace spread through the cabin, the chill in my body started to fade, but an odd sense of unease still lingered inside me. When I realized my phone wasn't with me, I let out a small sigh. "I left my phone in the room," I said. James rolled his eyes. "Me too," he muttered. Calling for help was pointless. The storm outside was still raging, and we were completely cut off from the world. James settled in front of the fire, and I pulled my blanket tighter around me as I moved closer. Our eyes met. "Looks like we're here for the night," James said, his voice low and warm. The fire crackled softly, its flickering glow casting shadows along the walls. But after a few hours, the flames started to shrink, the light dimming. James frowned as he realized our firewood was nearly gone. "Is there anything else we can burn?" he asked. I glanced around, but the cabin was nearly empty. One leg of the table looked unstable, but if we burned it, we'd be down a chair by morning. "We could break up that old chair," I suggested, shivering. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rickety wooden chair and slammed it against the floor. The wood splintered, and we gathered the smaller pieces, tossing them into the fireplace. The flames flared up for a moment, but even this wouldn't last long. As the fire dwindled, dark shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with the dimming light. The cabin's warmth was fading fast, and instinctively, I inched closer to James, my heartbeat quickened. James met my gaze, taking a slow, deep breath. "We need to find another way to stay warm," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Chapter 4. Closing distances. The flames in the fireplace had nearly died out. A cold, heavy silence filled the cabin. Even the soft crackling of burning wood had faded. James stared at the remaining embers, lost in thought. The last flickers of fire sent out a few dying sparks before vanishing completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. "There's so little left," he murmured, his voice low and pensive. I clung tightly to the blanket wrapped around me, but the cold still seeped into my bones. My fingers were frozen, stiff in the icy air, and my lips trembled as I exhaled nothing but the chill. For a moment, the darkness felt overwhelming, swallowing everything in its quiet solitude. James moved in the shadows. "We need another way," he said, stepping closer, his eyes locked on mine. "We have to find another way to stay warm." I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. My entire body was trembling, caught somewhere between the tension and the cold. James took a deep breath, then slowly leaned toward me. In that moment, I knew nothing about this night would be temporary. I wouldn't forget it, but at the same time, I knew neither of us was brave enough to fight whatever was pulling us closer. The space between us was vanishing. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, something kept drawing us together. James moved even closer. "We need more warmth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a slight tremor laced within it. "Maybe we can rely on each other's body heat." My body reacted instinctively, drawn toward his warmth. We were so close now that every movement, every slight touch felt like an unspoken reason to give in. In the silence, James's voice was the only thing that felt alive, cutting through the freezing air. He started, hesitating for just a second. We could keep each other warm with our body heat. Hearing him say it made it feel strangely right. Like this moment had been waiting for us all along. So close, so cold. Yet exactly what we needed. Chapter 5. Heat and Tension. James didn't break eye contact as he reached out for me. For a moment, I hesitated, but then all my uncertainty faded. His warmth felt like the only refuge in this freezing world. Slowly, I let my trembling body lean into him, resting my head on his shoulder, waiting for him to hear the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. This should help us warm up. He murmured, his voice steady now, though my own heart was still racing. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me even closer. As our bodies pressed together, the moment deepened, the darkness of the cabin closing in around us, bringing us even nearer. Wrapped in the heat of his embrace, I took a deep breath as his fingers traced gently along my back. And then I made a choice to move closer. My gaze lingered on his lips, stopping just inches away. The line between us, blurred by the cold wind and the storm outside, had all but disappeared. He pulled me in tighter and I let my eyes close. My body melted into his, the warmth of his touch intensifying everything around us. The only thing I could feel was his breath, his heat. The tension inside me swelled, a force pulling me towards something inevitable. At first, this was just about keeping warm. But suddenly, it became something else entirely. Every nerve in my body ached for his warmth, and I realized a fire had been lit deep inside me. As James's body pressed even closer to mine, the raw, unspoken emotions we had suppressed for so long began to surface. "We should do this," James whispered, his breath unsteady now. For a second, time stopped. My thoughts tangled, but my feelings were crystal clear. The intensity between us had never been sharper, never more undeniable. As we touched, as we sank into each other's warmth, there was no turning back. In that moment, there was only one thing, an undeniable fire between us, burning against the cold storm outside. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.